Hi, everyone. I'm Raj Kumar, President Editor-in-Chief of Devex. I am back again with my series of conversations with leaders during the COVID-19 crisis. Thanks for everybody joining this from all over the world. We've had a remarkable series of leaders really sharing with us what they and their organizations are doing and really having some in-depth and great discussions. And I'm honored today to have Gilbert Houngbo joining today. Gilbert is the President of the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Obviously one of the three major food and agriculture agencies of the UN, which is where you are now in HQ in Rome. For those of you who have not had the great pleasure to meet Gilbert, as I have in the past, he was born and raised in a rural area in Togo and grew to become the Prime Minister of his country, has had an incredible career across the private sector, the UN system. He was the Deputy Director General at the International Labor Organization. And now for the last 3 or 4 years has been leading IFAD, which is, of course, one of the world's leading institutions focused on the rural parts of the world. And if you're in global development, as I know everybody following this conversation is, the rural parts of the world are a key component of the work that we all do. So it is just a great honor to have you here, Gilbert, to talk about how this pandemic is affecting the people that you serve at IFAD and your own work. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe we could just start with what are you seeing in rural areas? And I mean, obviously there's a wide variety of countries that IFAD works in, and rural is a broad concept, but generally speaking, what do you think the impact has been of this pandemic on rural people?
First of all, thank you, Raj, for really inviting me for this series. Globally, what we have seen at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't have that much cases from a health perspective. So one would have thought that the rural sector, the rural community will be less exposed. So then right away, what has happened is the socioeconomic impact. So from psychologically, when you are saying that, okay, I'm a little bit shielded from the big cities, then to see past the socioeconomic impact hit hard, that has made it even a greater shock. We've seen cases at the beginning, communities with their products that all of a sudden the truck is not coming to pick it up because if we shut down. Then other communities that, oh, we were supposed to start the planting season 2 weeks from now, so there's no seed, and we're expecting the seed this week. So the socioeconomic impact right away starts quite very hard.
Do you think that the lockdowns were not done correctly when you consider the impacts on rural people? Is there a different way you want to see lockdowns done? Obviously, we may have more lockdowns in the future as the virus goes through other countries and waves potentially come. How do you want to see lockdowns handled in a different way?
You know, I might be biased here. You know, I've been in government. And in circumstances like this one, I honestly believe that by far and large, most of the government have done the best under the circumstances. It is easy for us to look and maybe even criticize the government or say that you should have done that differently, etc. But when you are on the front line, it's a different story. So I really need to put that clear. That being said, of course, what we have seen in the, one would have hoped that the community in general, the population in general, and the rural community in particular, where they have had a little bit more time to just prepare, to get prepared on that. So that's why you have seen in some countries, they have 2 weeks after the initial decision, they need to kind of adjust it on that. But one thing is for sure though, that one, whether you are from the northern country or the southern countries, every single country has had to go through an adjustment of the measure put in place. And we saw that also hard. So for the rural communities, it was very hard to understand. So it's the communication side were quite challenging. So the only thing that they know is, okay, you need to do a social distancing, the how, the why, etc. And quickly we took for granted that water was available, like wash your hand with soap. It's kind of the basic thing to do. Forgetting that we have 3 billion people in the world that do not have access to that potable water on that. So implementing those basic measure was not to be taken for granted.
What has it meant for food supplies? You know, I imagine in most of the countries where IFAD is working, you're working with small scale farmers, you're helping them improve their yields, diversify their crops, but they're selling it probably to the cities. What has happened there in terms of the food supply chains?
I mean, that this is one of our major worries, is that a lot of people may be pushed to food insecurity. And you know, we are very worried that this pandemic could lead easily to a food crisis, on that although the current state of the supply is sufficient, but the distribution of that supply is very, very challenging. The food waste and loss has, you know, in the past, I mean, generally speaking, we talk about 1/3 of the production that is lost for other existing reasons. So you can imagine the current circumstances, that percentage has grown up, where the production has been stopped there. The communities do not necessarily have enough storage to keep the production or basic transformation. And therefore that was a flat loss. On the other side, you also have countries that depend a lot on food imports. But with the lockdown of the borders or the whole transportation system, and countries that are depending on the import of the food could not import enough food. And just to keep in mind, if you take sub-Saharan Africa, you talk about 35 billion food import a year. So that gives you a sense of the magnitude of the problem we had. Then, what we have also noticed, you will not be surprised that I'm focusing on the rural communities. Even when measures were taken by a lot of government at a national level, including some of the initial emergency aids, one thing is to provide the aids at the corporate, at the global country level. But how do you make sure that those measures drill down to the rural communities were another challenge? So you could have seen, even within country, either the existing food reserve may be sufficient to cover the need. However, the in-country distribution challenge did not necessarily make it possible for all those food to arrive to the rural community before the food got lost.
Right, and many of these rural communities might be growing some of their own food, but they might still be monocultures, or they might not have a diversity of food that they need, right, for a complete diet. And so the food security issue can still exist even in agricultural communities.
Yeah, see, the problem was there already before. We do know that we are struggling with 820 million people that are food insecure. The nutrition seems to be a challenge. We know that also before. But what is happening, all of that is increasing to the point where the community that were kind of in the monoculture, it was part of our program, like IFAD program and other colleagues program as well, to encourage the communities to diversify the production as on that. But I hope we'll get there. You see, the challenge that we have seen is the fact that the community, not only in the rural area for that one, is also with the informal sector in big cities. When people are essentially living, you know, from hand to mouth on a daily basis, it makes it very, very, very hard to have to readjust on that. So this is what has happened. Either they have a very small reserve and therefore they couldn't adjust it, or some of them, the pandemic hit at a period which is recognized to be the lean period, where even in the normal circumstances that the reserve are very at the lowest level. So that's where the problem started. So on one hand, one also of my concern is the fact that all of that, obviously our colleagues from the humanitarian side, they are quite very active to ensure food distribution, etc. One of my concerns in all of that, obviously, while addressing the immediate short-term needs, one of the unintended consequence is to increase the dependency on food aid on that. So which is something that we will have as part of the rebuilding, the building back we really need to address.
You know, you're in Italy, I'm in the United States, and one of the challenges, I think we've got people following this conversation from all over the world, and they're starting to submit questions. Go right ahead, please do submit those. But one of the challenges, I think, is getting our heads around how this pandemic is different in different countries. Some countries are coming way down. They're getting to the end of their first wave. Others are still plateaued in the middle of their first wave. And many of the other ones, including a lot of the lowest income countries where IFAD works, are at the beginning maybe. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to predict exactly where they'll go. But I guess when we talk about these issues of food insecurity, of supply chains, how are you seeing the moment that we're at the beginning? Are we in the middle? Are we in the end? You've had time to figure them out and to work with governments, or are we right at the beginning of these trends for rural communities?
To be quite frank with you, in a lot of countries, nobody can give you the answer. Even our colleague from WHO, the expert from the health dimension, in some countries, it's very difficult to, it doesn't matter which model you're running, they have to be very, very, very prudent. One of the reasons of what the COVID-19 has taught us is the challenge of data, the availability of data to be able to have as precise modeling as possible. So you just have to find ways to act despite those challenges, those kind of shortcomings. So whether in a lot of low-income countries, you want to believe that the peak has been reached and now things start going down the curve, then the following 3-4 days, you realize, in fact, we are still climbing on that. So you need to just, whether you are hitting the peak or not, you need to have a strategy where, while you are addressing the short-term need from the humanitarian, the emergency side, you start also investing in the recovery dimension so that we can make sure that from the food security perspective that by the next season that we can minimize the risk of food shortage.
Yeah, I wonder, because IFAD works directly with governments, right? You partner with the government, you want to be demand driven based on what governments are interested in and looking for. And I read that you have talked about governments asking you to shift a significant portion of IFAD's resources given the pandemic. Have they been shifting it more in a humanitarian direction? What kind of work is IFAD doing right now in the response? And is there a danger, as you're suggesting, that maybe you're not investing in the long-term rural development questions as we try to just address humanitarian immediate needs?
No, for us, yes, it's true that we have received requests from around 65, 70 countries for us to really come to assist. And we decided to be as flexible as possible to repurpose our project in on those countries. And even countries that did not come to us initially, where we do have ongoing project, we did make the offer, and which has been very, very welcome. So
what kind of repurposing? Yeah, what would you move the money to do?
Yeah, a typical example will be in one country, for example, is to help communities, because of all we discussed earlier, Raj. A lot of rural communities cannot make their payment, the debt payment, to the microcredit institution. So they are really at risk on the financing side. So our resources can be repurposed to help making the payment for the next 3 months while we try to find other solutions. So at least we protect them so they are sure that they can continue their production. In another country like Senegal is just making sure that working with other colleagues from the international, we can use our resources, our project resources, repurpose them to buy seeds for the next production session. Or in Bangladesh, for example, what we try to do is really working with the government to quickly change the response policy, the COVID response policy, to ensure that the situation of the rural community is integrated into it. And therefore, that has helped to make exception for some of the transportation system, so the produce will not be lost, can be picked up. In other countries, we repurpose our projects so the resources can be used to help the government to buy those production that are at risk of being lost. And the government can therefore use those production and distribute that to maybe those that are suffering from COVID and do not have access to food. So there are different ways, and obviously we do that based on the discussion we have with the government, because it's true that for us it remains essential that it's really demand-driven and government is in charge.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. I want to just go back to one of the points you made about microfinance institutions in particular, because I hadn't really personally considered the role they're playing here, but you're right, they are often a really important bridging mechanism for farmers in the lean season, in the hungry season, to be able to afford their seeds and fertilizer to grow their crop for the next season. What are you hearing from microfinance institutions? Are they looking to be providing concessions to farmers? Are you in conversations with that community at all?
I mean, the intention is there, the goodwill is there, but we also have to understand some of their situation as well. They can go that far, but cannot put their own financial sustainability at risk. So it's how do you find that middle ground, which is most of the time the problem that we are facing. So the type of intervention I made reference to very often help them that even if we can provide 3 months, then they can consider adding 1-2 months to that. So it creates some kind of a multiplying effect on that. So globally, I would say that they're doing their best, quite frankly. But the whole problem of the rural finance become quite much more acute in the current circumstances, just like the digital as well. In addition to the rural finance, something that we are really realizing is that already a lot of us are working on the digital act for the rural communities, but we've got to step it up clearly.
Yeah, I want to come back to that in a moment, but let me just ask you, thinking about finances again, about remittances, because I think half of the recipients of remittances around the world live in rural communities. And I know you came out with a call recently saying that you want to see remittance providers to be deemed essential services. Is there a challenge that you're seeing there, or do you see remittances going down in rural communities, or that there's a lack of access to the financial institutions that provide them?
No, it's very clear that unfortunately, given the situation in developed economies, we can see already that it's very well known that the remittances are expected to go down by 20-23%, which in itself is around $110 billion dollars for the rest of the 2020. So the remittances, as you mentioned, are part of the lifeline for the rural community. So that has a direct impact on the income available for the rural community. So I'm glad you're raising this. You know, so when you look at it, the issue is not just food security. The issue is pushing the whole rural community down to poverty. So the effort, we know this year is going to be the first year since the 90s where instead of improving the situation to global poverty, that we might go backward, hopefully not that much, but we might go backward. So those remittances, normally they help also the rural communities to be able to engage in income generating activities, ensuring that the kids can go to school and so forth. So all of that is what is being put to question now, given that the drop in the remittance. So our call is for what? our call is by declaring that as part of the essential services, we hope the government can consider ways within their authority to reduce the fees that are being charged in the remittance industry.
So I think you answered that question really well, Gilbert. Maybe we can move to this another theme I wanted to get your take on. You started talking about it with digital agriculture, and that is a lot of the leaders I'm talking to of major institutions like IFAD are telling me they think there's going to be a pre-coronavirus world and a post-coronavirus world, that things are really going to change. I wonder if you agree with that from your perch, looking at rural communities around the world, and what you think some of those changes actually will be.
I fully 100% agree with that. To me, in the rural communities, that being said, you know, at the end of the day, we're dealing with a terrible situation from a health perspective. But I see it as one of those shocks that always come now and then will come, and we are ill-prepared to face on that. So moving forward, in this case, to me, there are, I would say, three major pillars. One is precision agriculture. So far, we have considered that as, you know, for the commercial farm and the big farm, but more and more we need to step up the maximizing the use of technology in the rural communities, in the rural small scale producers.
And that technology exists, and it's not that expensive, right? I mean, you can take a picture of soil, you can analyze it automatically and see what the nutrients are, and get advice on the right things to plant, the right fertilizers to add, right?
Yeah, indeed. You know, you might tend to think that, you know, you don't need the high technology, high tech, or the latest innovation. Sometimes the low cost existing technology makes a big difference. You know, a week ago, I was in discussion with Michael Kramer, the Nobel Prize winner, on precision agriculture for development. And this is one of the big outcome of their research, is the fact that you don't need big latest technology or expensive technology to have a direct impact in increasing the income of the smallholders, on the smallholders.
That was, I think, the first pillar you talked about where you see things shifting. One is precision agriculture. What are the other two?
Yeah, I thought about three pillars. Digital ag is the first one. The second one is the resilience. Yeah, of course, we have been working on that, but clearly we really need to invest more in a different type of resilience for the smallholders. And that could go from looking for ways, or better ways, to find a long-lasting solution on insurance for rural communities when it comes to natural disaster or climate change related shocks that we have, or shocks like coronavirus. So the whole insurance against disaster, it seems to me that one thing that we will need to step up. Then the third pillar for me is the whole social protection, the social protection for the rural communities. And I'm very, very keen to work with other colleagues and with the government. That's what to be our contribution to have a minimum set of safety nets for the rural communities. That is going to be essential.
Yeah, and an example of that could be what you've done for microfinance, of providing a stopgap payment in a time of crisis. It's almost like an insurance, except that in this case, it's coming directly, I guess, from your grant funding, as opposed to an investment instrument. So it's not as sustainable and it's limited, but maybe if it's planned and programmed in advance as an instrument, a financial instrument, maybe you can get a lot more benefit out of it.
Indeed. There are some ongoing insurance program initiatives. Obviously, we know the problematic that the premium remain quite high as we speak, but I really hope that by keep digging, being innovative, we will be able to bring that to a level that we can maximize the participation of most of the small-scale producers.
So tell us about what this has meant for your institution itself. You have 800 people who work there at IFAD. You're in the office, we can tell, but I'm guessing not many others are, and yours is an institution where people have to travel. You travel all over the world. That's obviously a lot more challenging now in this environment. How has work at IFAD been affected by this?
No, first of all, I'm very grateful to all our staff that have been quite very flexible and ready to do their bit, not only for their own sake and their family, but always thinking about the client. And a lot of our colleagues are responsible for the ongoing projects on the ground. They have been very, very, very concerned. And therefore, we have to be very creative in, first of all, how do we ensure safety of our staff, on our project staff, and the communities that beneficiaries that are there. And secondly, how do we ensure that those communities do not end up by selling their meager assets, like their livestock or equivalent, to be able to survive. So this is, so in the repurposing of our project that I talked about before, we have to clearly address this, ensuring that our beneficiaries are protected as we can. What has been difficult to do is really the visits of the project. Normally from time to time, we have in-person project supervision activities where you really have to go there. So that one, whenever possible, we try to use local resources, but in some cases, it has been very difficult for us to follow up on our projects on the ground, given the measure that the government locally may have taken.
I noticed you were one of, I think, 22 senior UN officials who signed a joint reflections document about systemic racism. You directly referenced the situation with the murder of George Floyd in the United States and the issue of police brutality. And I wonder if you might have some reflections you want to share with all of us on these issues, which are so prevalent now in terms of systemic racism, decolonizing development, a theme that's coming up a lot in our community. You've been, a veteran of the UN system for a long time, the international system. How do you see these issues interacting with our work?
No, clearly is an issue of great concern, which happened. Yes, it's true that the beginning of this was with the death of George Floyd, but we also know how it has spread out in the whole world. So it's an issue that is spread all over the world. We need to take it from that angle. It's also important for me to mention that all of us decide to do that, to sign that in our personal capacity, not necessarily in our official capacity. To me, when I look at the global issue of racism, but I just cannot dissociate it from the issue about discrimination, the big gap or the growing gap between the have and the have-not. So the challenge that we have is one of bringing back, the social injustice. And that remind me my days in ILO. One of the fundamental issues for which ILO was created is this social justice. So moving forward, and that's also what coronavirus has helped us bring back to the table. If it's true that anybody can get coronavirus regardless of your race, regardless of your religion, or your sexual orientation, or your status in life, but we also know that in terms of victim and the death toll, coronavirus has affected much more people that one can consider much more as they have not, rather than those that one will consider as they have. So moving forward, I sincerely believe that we also have to spend, the government, the international community will have to really have special initiatives to really curb the big issue we have in terms of social injustice across the globe.
And I wonder whether this is that moment, as I've been talking to leaders like you, whether there's an opportunity to think much bigger, to be much more ambitious. I mean, we live in a world with so much dramatic inequality, and maybe it's most evident, most stark when you think of rural communities and the gap. I mean, was it 80% of the extreme poor in the world live in rural areas?
Yeah, this is exactly why for me I couldn't help it by saying that I got not only based on personal values, but every day of what we do, what IFAD does, every time I'm on the field, every time I have to leave those communities, I always asking myself, Gilbert, are you doing enough? Is IFAD doing enough? And it's crucial, and I cannot repeat that enough, that we got to not only the international community, the government too, be it at international, national, and local level, stop thinking that, well, those gaps have existed for decades or for centuries, they will always be there. We just have to consider that is unacceptable, and making sure that we put long-lasting measures to ensure that we can really, it goes back to SDG 10. So it's not today that we're discussing about that, the fight against inequality. And sometimes those inequalities are not necessarily in terms of monetary resources. It was the inequality of how we treat each other, how we consider our neighbors. So it goes, and you cannot solve some of the issue, you will solve it through legislation and through policy, but every single human being will have to contribute on that. So it's a very complex, and I'm using this opportunity to call on each one of us, all those that are listening to us, to ask themselves, what can I do to have my little contribution to really help solving this issue of social injustice?
Well, thank you for that message. I think it's a great message to end on. It's an important one, and I know that our community at Devex is very concerned with these issues and appreciate your leadership on it. So thank you for taking some time to talk with me today. Sorry about the technical difficulty.
Thank you so much for having me.
These are issues we are going to continue to cover at Devex, so we'll be in touch, and I look forward to seeing you in person again soon, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Raj. I appreciate you having me